Hello, Tiffany.
Hello.
How are you? Thank you for joining us today. I'm
Of
really
course.
excited.
Yes, happy Friday.
Yes, Friday is the best day. So thank you so much for joining us and talking to us about your amazing book. I got the chance to meet you in person was it last week? It feels like ages ago.
Ooh. Yeah, it was last week actually. I was going to say 2 weeks ago, but it was just last week.
Yeah, so that was really awesome. For anybody watching who doesn't know, Tiffany Yu is an amazing advocate, and I'll let her introduce herself. But she's the author of our group read, the Anti-Ableist Manifesto. So I'll pass it off to you to share your intro.
Sure. Hi everyone. This is Tiffany Yu. Pronouns are she, her. And as Erin mentioned, I am the author of a book that came out last fall called The Anti-Ableist Manifesto: Smashing Stereotypes, Forging Change, and Building a Disability Inclusive World. And outside of writing this book, I run a community called Diversability and a couple of other things too. But generally, I guess I describe myself as a disability advocate. And I come into this space based on off of my own lived experience of acquiring a disability at the age of 9 as a result of a car accident.
Yes, and I'm just so excited to talk to you about your book, and I'm gonna dive into the questions. But let's start that. So our first question is, how did you decide on the name of your book, and why Manifesto particularly?
Yes. So I love starting with this question because I actually didn't really set out to write a book. A couple of years ago in December of 2020, I decided I was going to start a short form social media series called the Anti-Ableism series. And generally, the series was in response to the question, how can I show up better for the disability community? So I started this series. Now, as we're recording this, it's May of 2025. So what is that? Is that 5? This is me not being able to do dates in my head. But five-ish years later, the series has over 300 parts. The last time I was tracking, it has reached over 5 million views. And so somewhere along that process, a literary agent and a publisher ended up reaching out asking if I had thought about diving a little bit deeper into some of the concepts that were introduced through the Anti-Ableism series. So we kind of got together, and the title, the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, kind of came to be. And part of why I called it a manifesto is actually this is introduced at the end of the book, but what I'm holding up is a postcard that has a piece of art on it titled The Anti-Ableist Manifesto. And it has about 30 statements on it that are displayed in block letters of different fonts. And it ranges from things like disability is not a bad word or a bad thing, diversify your feed, accommodations and accessibility promote equity. And so the idea behind uh, as we were thinking, or as I was thinking about a book that would be called the Manifesto, I wanted to be able to kind of have punchy directive statements or actionable statements that would help kind of guide what ended up becoming the manifesto in book form. And there are a couple of phrases that we kind of use within the disability community quite a bit. We'll say, not all disabilities are apparent. Disability is not a bad word or a bad thing. We're not a monolith. And so in some ways I kind of thought about, okay, what are phrases that we say a lot? And in some ways those are like mini manifestos. And what would that look like if we could turn those into chapters? So as I took a step back, I said, okay, I have all these phrases in my mind now. How can we structure this in a way where people are taken it makes sense from a learning journey perspective. So I ended up choosing a framework called Me, We, Us, which is something I learned about 10 years ago in social impact spaces about how we can make transformative change. So what do I need to know about disability and ableism? A lot of that section is about language, inclusive language, shared definitions. Then what do we need to know in relation with each other? That section is a lot about microaggressions, how to interrupt them. And then finally, what do all of us need to know about disability and ableism so that we can create the type of societal change that we're hoping for? And I chose that framework because, this year we are celebrating, or hopefully celebrating, the 35th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I am someone who is part of what is known as the ADA generation, meaning for that, as long as I've been disabled, this landmark piece of legislation has been around to protect our rights. Yet at the same time, the onus is still very heavily weighed on disabled people to enforce it. And at the same time, we're also noticing, okay, great that we've had this law for 35 years, but if our hearts and minds and attitudes and perceptions around disability aren't caught up to kind of close that gap, then we're still not going to see this piece of legislation enforced. And I think for far too long, last thing I'll say is we've always looked at laws as like the end all be all of how we can create systemic change. And I actually think that's only a part of it, because great that we have a law in place. But again, if in our minds we are still devaluing disabled bodies and our minds, then we're not going to actually enforce those laws, and they end up just being there as performative pieces of legislation that exist unless we as a disabled community exert energy and spoons to be able to enforce it and have our rights recognized and realized.
Absolutely. And your book came out at the perfect time, because we definitely need more media like this that really challenges incorrect assumptions about disability and tries to, make change. That's great. Thank you for sharing. This is kind of a personal question, even though it's not really, because I am also writing a book, fiction, not nonfiction, a romance. But
and I think when I saw Erin in person, I told her that I think we actually need more disability fiction. I mean, we need more disability narratives all around, but I'm really excited that you're working on a fiction book.
Thank you. Yeah. So my question is, how long did it take you to write your book? Because I'm on year 2.
So I will take a step back and give you some dates as a general reference. And I do think I will say one trend that I am noticing in the social media era that we're living in is we're actually seeing a lot of content creators or disabled creators kind of get book deals in a little bit of a non-conventional way.
Mm-hmm.
So again, started the Anti-Ableism series as this TikTok, Instagram series, YouTube Shorts in December of 2020. And then in March of 2021, I had a literary agent reach out to me. So March 2021. And a couple months after that, I can't remember, it must have been like early 2022, I had a publisher reach out saying, hey, have you thought about writing a book? Which ultimately ended up becoming the Anti-Ableist Manifesto. But I didn't end up getting the book deal. So at this particular point in time, I hadn't really written anything other than the book proposal. So I got the book deal on November 11th, 11/11, 2022. So March 2021, a literary agent reaches out about a year and a half later, get a book deal. That takes us to November 2022. So from November 2022 until around December 2023, that was the amount of time I had to kind of write the book. In full transparency, I did not make that December 2023 timeline. I think I ended up submitting the first full draft manuscript in January of 2024. And then rounds of edits, and then the book came out in October of 2024. So the short answer, that was the long answer, because I wanted to give people the whole timeline that from the point in time of me starting to even think about a book to when it came out was about 3.5 years. But the actual writing in itself, which I will acknowledge may have seemed like a little bit more of an expedited time frame, was about a year or a little bit more than a year.
Right. Yeah. I think people don't realize how long it takes to not just write it, but to get it published, get it edited, and all those steps.
Yes. And then there are so many steps after the book comes out too,
Right.
is the promo. So yes, so I call it you have to find micro self-care throughout this kind of marathon process of putting out a book, but always love being in a community with other writers and especially disabled writers.
That is great. And building that community of fellow writers is really helpful, even as you're writing or editing, or because there's a lot of emotions, I'm sure, that come along with writing a book, especially one that's so personal.
Yeah, I will say, and this is all public, I remember recording, I had like a book behind the scenes little playlist on social media. And I remember it was January 2024. And I kind of came on and I was like crying. And actually, I felt like throughout the process of writing the book, because that was the hardest part for me, I was just so overwhelmed and so stressed. And I also didn't take any time off. So I was writing on weekends, and in some ways it's like, how do you find those breaks or that micro self-care through this process? And I wish we spent more time kind of talking about that, because I now feel really grateful to meet other authors. And I make this joke that we have this similar weary look in our eyes because of everything that went into getting this book out into the world, when most of the public facing side of it is, oh, we see Tiffany's orange book everywhere, she's crushing it. And then I'm like, I just want a break.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of energy that is consumed by writing a book. So this is also, I'm very curious about this, and I will share my experience too. But before learning about disability and being around disabled people, how did you view disability, and what was that change like, if it has changed?
I will say that probably like many other people, I didn't grow up knowing a lot of other disabled people. Part of why I also shared kind of like my disability origin story as someone who acquired my disability, I saw a dramatic change and shift in my body from one day to the next. So I want to acknowledge that with kind of like acquiring a disability, there is going to be a grief process. And Jane Mattingly has written a book called This is Body Grief, around grief, kind of like the unique experience of grief that you have when you live in a body, which is all of us. And and so I think after I became disabled, I kind of looked at whatever examples I had available to me of what living in a disabled body looked like. And the media and most of what I understood around disability was that it was really shameful. You shouldn't bring attention to it. For me, one of my arms is permanently paralyzed. And if I don't wear my wrist splint or wear long sleeves, you might not be able to tell. So I could technically kind of cover. And I had kind of internalized, even as the daughter of Asian immigrants, like if I bring a little bit of intersectionality in, is to not draw attention to any difference. So I grew up, I call it like internalizing a lot of shame around existing in a disabled body. And I will say that even up until like 2020, before I started started doing more video content, I noticed, and I can go back and look at like Instagram posts where I'm hiding my arm or I've like cropped it out. And I had to do some of my own reflecting, even in 2020, which is just 5 years ago, around how I had always rejected like the disabled part of my body as like part of my whole body. And one example of this, I guess I'll share, is kind of being in physical therapy. So I'm someone who is going to need lifelong rehabilitation for my paralyzed arm. And I would show up at physical therapy and they would be so fixated on the limitations of my paralyzed arm, versus there has been a shift over the last couple of years where I've started taking some workout classes, or I've tried, adaptive climbing, or I did my first triathlon. And all of those sports are just about like your whole body and the way it's working together. And I actually think even in that instance, noticing a shift in my body and just acknowledging that my disabled arm is still part of my body. And if I'm going to exercise, I'm going to try to use whatever movement I do have available to me. That said, that was kind of like the 2020 breaking point. But it all, I think, started in 2009. And in 2009, it was really a shift around I don't want to feel shame about who I am. And I also don't want to feel like a shell of myself or that I'm hiding parts of my story. And so 2009 kind of felt so the car accident was in 1997. 2009 kind of felt like the beginning of my own journey of exploring what it meant to own disability as a part of my identity and acknowledge that it did impact the way I moved about the world. And then I will say, probably 2020 was really coming to terms with and better understanding just the physical, visible manifestation of my arm. Yes, it looks different. This is what my arm looks like, right? And going through maybe like a second journey of acceptance around just owning that this is my one body.
Yeah, like that acceptance is hard to get to, but once you get to it, it's like calming almost, and you feel like at least I felt like I was finally found a place where I was always okay with who I was, but not okay about my disability, and having that acceptance is so helpful. Because when I was young, I think I'm a little older than you. We did not have the internet until I was in high school, like 16, 17. And I didn't know any other disabled people in my personal life because I lived in a small town. We had a small school. They like added elevators to our high school because of me. I was the first one. So it felt like, to me, my only understanding of my disability came from the MDA telethons. And I was like, that isn't me. I'm not sad about my disability. I'm not sad, I should say. I'm not sad every day about who I am. So to me, I was not disabled because I wasn't like that. And once I got the internet, I found other people like me who were not, this idea of pity and, oh my God, change these children who need your help so much. I didn't connect to that. That wasn't what I felt about myself. So finding other people like me allowed me to accept my disability and the label of disabled. So yeah, that was.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing. And something I do think about is that now in the current social media era that we exist in, it's a lot easier to find each other than it was before, right?
Yeah.
I can literally, so the name of my injury, it's called a brachial plexus injury. I can go search that hashtag, and I have now found a handful of other people who live with my injury, or now I have access to Facebook groups where I can go search for that. And I think part of what I feel excited about is, yes, thank you to the internet. Thank you, thank you to social media, that the healthy parts of it in some ways, for enabling us to find each other much quicker, so we don't have to feel so isolated and alone, and only see the holiday phonathon as the only place where disabled people are represented.
Absolutely, yes. And even though like the internet, even in my lifetime, obviously, the internet has changed so much, where even in the past 5 years, it's very different. There's a lot of negativity, and I find that building your own space on social media that is outside of like the general social media is so important, because there's a lot of hate out there and access to everyone's opinions and everyone's thoughts, and everyone says everything on the internet now without thinking of how it would impact somebody. Um, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I love the idea. I talk a lot about making sure that we are setting boundaries with, if we are someone who is public on social media, just making sure that you have your safe places of support, whether it exists in other online spaces or chosen family or in person.
Yes, chosen family, very important. Okay, the next question is, I lost it. Here it is. This kind of relates to that because how do you balance your advocacy while protecting your peace?
Yes, I love this question. And I wonder if in some ways you have to kind of reach a breaking point to realize how important rest is for our sustainability in this work. So I will share just fully transparently, there's a period of time where I felt like I was pouring out of an empty cup. Because one thing I love, right, is I love building communities. That's just something I became really passionate about. And I guess I didn't realize at the time that when you are a community builder, you need your own communities too. And so I'm actually in a community now of other people who run communities. But we all need our people, right? And so I think one thing I had to learn is that dismantling ableism is not going to be entirely on me. That is way too large of a burden for just one person. And I have a chapter in the book where I talk about, showing up in solidarity for other people and the power of collective action. And I have to acknowledge that, I think the reason this book exists may is because of everyone else who paved the way before us, whether it was those who paved the way for the that led to the passage of the ADA, or it was other disabled authors who were writing books before this one came out, before yours comes out. So just acknowledging that we're kind of like all working toward inclusion together. And so what does that look like? Part of that for me was I moved to Los Angeles, which is my favorite playground. And one of the things I like about being here is I get to I get to wear different hats. I'm not Tiffany the disability advocate all the time. And one thing even throughout the promotion of this book is I'm not going to have a hot take on everything that's going on in the world right now. And there's a lot that's going on even in the context of disability. And so how can I trust that I am in a community of other advocates and other activists who maybe have more energy to talk about the things that I may not have the expertise in. And part of that is just understanding that sometimes our best advocacy tool is just sharing and amplifying someone else and the things that they're working on or the things that they've said. But yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this, like just having stronger boundaries around time and I actually do think that's really helped. Sleep, if that is something that is important to you, and it's something that has become really important to me, is just making sure that not only am I getting sleep, but there's actually a TEDx talk out there that talks about like the 7 different types of rest. So there's like social rest, creative rest, physical rest, just making sure that I'm continuing to get rest because again, we have to figure out some way to be sustainable in this work because it's going to continue. And there's a quote that I really like, and the quote is, "The fight for justice is a marathon relay." And even in the context of this conversation, Erin, you talked about how when the internet came to be and the changes, or even the changes that have happened with the emergence of social media over the past 5 years, right? Is that advocacy and activism, it actually looks very different than it probably did, even 5, 10, 15 years ago, 20, 35. And so marathon relay, we're in it. And when I even think about the imagery of a marathon relay, I'm like, woo, that sounds like a very tiring thing. But it's also making me realize the things that we're going to be fighting for, hopefully things are improving, maybe not at the pace that we would like, but they are.
Mm-hmm.
To believe and hope that they are getting better. But we will always find and continue to find new ways of things that we can advocate for. So I know, right now, artificial intelligence is top of mind. You can't have a conversation without mentioning it. But also,
Right.
sure, how can we envision what disability-centered artificial intelligence might look like, or how does it enhance accessibility, and how do we make sure that's in the conversation? And 10 years ago, that was not even in the conversation, other than that movie with Haley Joel Osment.
Yeah. Yes, AI is wild. Like, even in the last year, it's just exploded everywhere. But yeah, I think it's so important. Thank you for talking about sleep, because sleeping is underrated. And just having, like, the time that I'm the most relaxed and chill is when I'm in bed about to go to sleep. And yeah, for me, what I do to protect my peace is I turn off social media at 5 o'clock every day and just disconnect. Because, like you said, we're in this forever, and we can't spend all of our spoons every single day, because that is not how you fight, and it's not ever going to be successful without taking, self-care as an important issue.
Yeah. And I will also add, it may not seem like it, but I'm actually a super introvert who has to do some
So,
extroverted things sometimes. And so even I saw Erin in DC last week, and it was an intense couple of days and long days that we were together. And after that, I just went home and I didn't talk to anyone for 2 days, and then it was time to show up for the next thing, right? So it's also just knowing what your energy levels are and what you have the capacity to do, and respecting that for yourself, like not trying to drive yourself into the ground, and just trust again that we're all part of a larger movement together, and
right.
collective action is really what's going to help move the needle forward.
Yes, and understanding that everyone has different limits, and to not put pressure on yourself for saying, I'm not doing enough, because you're doing as much as you can. Every person is different. Um, so this is kind of, you mentioned it earlier, but how have your identities impacted how you view disability?
Mm. So there is a chapter in the book where I talk about like the different models of disability. And there are usually three main ones that I will talk about. One is the medical model, where you have this medical diagnosis and you go to medical professionals or doctors to get treated or cured or fixed. Then there's the tragedy model, where the expectations are set very low for disabled people. People don't expect us to amount to much. That's kind of like where the pity narrative or the phonathon that Erin had mentioned kind of falls in there. And then there's the social model that says, there are a billion of us that are disabled. It's really our external environment that we need to work on making a little bit more accessible, so that those of us who do have disabilities, which is 1 in 6, 1 in 4 if you're in the US, or 1 in 6 if you're looking globally, that we don't experience access friction trying to participate equitably throughout the world. Then I found there were all these other models as well. I think I mentioned like 8 others. And one of them was called the moral model of disability. And essentially, the moral model, it has some religious roots to it, but the idea behind it is that disability was kind of like a moral failing somewhere in the ancestral lineage. My understanding of that was that essentially, because I have a disability now, there was some bad luck in my ancestral lineage that is passed on through generations. And as the daughter of Asian immigrants, that actually felt like the model through which my parents viewed disability, which is, if anything bad happens in the family to someone in the family, which reflects the entire household, it means that there is some reason that happened that may have happened in a different, in a different generations, again, somewhere in the ancestral lineage. And I bring that up because I did some research on what it meant to be Asian and disabled. And one of the things that came up was the way that the first was that how mental illness is not viewed as a disability, which also means you have much larger numbers of people of Asian heritage who are not seeking support for their mental health. What else did I find? Again, I've kind of found like this bad luck idea. So if you do have the ability to, if you have a non-apparent disability, which the majority of disabilities are, you're actually seeing people who don't have visible physical apparent disabilities getting support for their non-apparent disabilities as well. And I think that I have compassion for my parents' generation, and maybe for many of our parents' generation, that disability culturally was just very much, I think, viewed through the medical model. Like, this is a health thing. There's no culture, community, history, empowerment, pride behind it. And in some ways, I feel like we are breaking that intergenerational pattern where so many of us have found community, have found our voice with each other. So, I'll also add that in one of the cultural beliefs in my family's culture was that the boys are the prized possession. And I have brothers and a sister. And I could see that I could even see that my mom, before my dad passed away, so he passed away in the car accident where I became disabled, I could see how she operated within the family unit as a mom. And then when she became a single parent, she had to become like my mom and my dad. And I could actually see a shift in the way that she moved about the world. And again, I have a lot of respect for that. But I also think about, in this one body, as someone who is Asian, I'm a woman, which means that through the lens of certain Asian cultures, I'm devalued as a woman, and then I'm devalued in a disabled body, and then I, step out of being the daughter of Asian immigrants, and I'm devalued because of my race. And I remember reading this one article that talked about kind of what it felt like to exist in a body that held, I don't know, sexism and ableism and racism all intertwined with each other. But then even within certain Asian communities, there was amplified sexism and ableism as well. And it's just like all in this one body. But essentially, I guess all of that to say that intersectionality and disability intersectionality really just highlights the way that culture and other aspects of our identity impacts the way we view disability, and also create a unique compounded experience that may be different from other people. And I think having the patience to better understand the perspectives that people are bringing into conversations is important. Because
Yeah.
oh,
No,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Oh, I will also share that I remember when I was first starting to find my voice in this space, right? So I want to share that for about a decade after I became disabled. I never talked about it. I don't think I identified as disabled. I didn't have a disability community. I didn't understand disability culture. And once I started to find my voice, I realized that there was a lot of unlearning of the shame or even internalized ableism that I believed or that I internalized due to different aspects of my cultural upbringing.
Yes, I hear you totally. Yeah, like you say in your book a lot that disability is not a monolith, and like having, different, everyone's different, and having a different culture and different genders and sexuality and all of that is just really changes how someone experiences and understands disability. Um, my mother is Hispanic, and I grew up a lot in a Hispanic household, and they don't they don't think mental illness is real. Like you said, it's like you'll get over that, or just do something else. Don't be sad. And it's that kind of internalizes in yourself that a part of you is wrong,
Mm.
and it's really hard to get over that. And it's still something that I struggle with, because of that cultural pressure to be okay all the time. Um,
Yeah, and I think there's a stat out there. I think it's from Made of Millions where they say that there's about an 11-year treatment gap for people who have mental health disabilities or mental illnesses, and I get it. And I wasn't diagnosed with PTSD until 22 years after the car accident. And in some ways, I look on paper, you can watch videos or, if you just hear the story of a kid getting into a car accident where some people lived and some people didn't, and some people acquired disabilities. I actually didn't use the word trauma to describe the car accident until 19 years after. I had just called it the car accident up until like trauma wasn't a part of my vocabulary. And I do wonder, looking back, if someone had named that's what it was, or that's what I had experienced, or even that word trauma felt like it was a part of my vocabulary, maybe I would have been more motivated to seek treatment or mental health support. But again, it just wasn't part of my vocabulary
right.
growing up because, my mom is a refugee from the Vietnam War. My dad's from Taiwan. Like, they're carrying over whether it's little t trauma in just coming over to the US, right? And so it's like when it's so embedded within your own family's history, is it still trauma when lowercase t trauma things happen? But or you could argue capital T, whatever. But it's yeah, it's maybe that's the next book, is kind of digging into intergenerational trauma and like when it's so embedded in the family's lineage, like
Yeah,
how do people actually view trauma, or is it kind of swept under the rug?
right. There's a comedian. He's on Saturday Night Live, and he's very funny, and he did a whole skit about how every time he brings up a problem that he's having to his mother, she's like, "Oh, did you survive communism?" And I got that so much because my mom is also a refugee, and every time there's a problem, she's like, that's what I had to do. That's what my family had to do." And it's like, I get it, but these are and having, like you said, access to the vocabulary to understand your own issues or your own trauma is so validating and necessary.
Yeah.
And
And
so,
and I
It
Oh,
shows why access to services and supports is so vital.
yeah. And I was just going to add that I I just keep coming back to compassion. And in a lot of ways, I think about the ways our parents came here for a better life. So then we did, right? And then our hope, and so through their lens, we look entitled, but we're exactly manifesting what they were hoping was that we wouldn't have to go through the things that they go through. And again, this comes back to the marathon relay. So we're now going to go through our new things, which they may not understand, but it's it's not going to be what they went through because we came here to avoid that, but now we're going to have we're going to have our own thing.
Right. Yeah. There's the whole idea of like, look how we survived, so you can survive. So we're almost out of time, but I did want to ask a question from one of our viewers, and Ivan is here. Hello, Ivan. Thank you for joining us. Ivan had a question asking. They said that in your book you say that disability is a neutral thing, and how did you come to that, and how can somebody struggling with your disability, the symptoms of your disability, how can they see disability as something that isn't a struggle?
Mm. I will say, and actually, Erin, I'm curious your perspective on this too. I always get asked the question, like, what would you tell your younger self? What would you tell 9-year-old Tiffany when she was at the hospital after, after this car accident? And something that goes through my mind is, I think we'll say things like, oh, it gets better, or like, you're going to get through this. But when things are really hard, you're in it. And what I'm going to say isn't going to land with you. And so it's also like, how can we make space that, and I think Emily Liddell says this, she says, disability pride is not being happy-go-lucky all the time around our disabilities. It's also acknowledging that it's struggle and that it's frustrating, especially if our disabilities are progressive or dynamic. And it's also a struggle to exist in a world, and frustrating to try to have to negotiate for access for yourself all the time, right? And so I know it's kind of like a non-answer in a way, but and that's my own kind of like disability privilege, where there are actually some people who have my injury, who live with a paralyzed arm, who experience really debilitating pain, and I'm in my brachial plexus injury Facebook group, and it's all around like pain management, um, and because kind of my symptoms fluctuate don't fluctuate and aren't volatile. Like, my arm's paralyzed today, it was paralyzed 25 years ago. Tomorrow it's it's paralyzed too. Um, uh, I can look at it as neutral, right? Because I've lived in this body that isn't fluctuating, where I have to develop a new narrative for myself every day. And so I just want to kind of just acknowledge where you are. And I think it's okay to kind of like sit in that space. And part of what actually feels really healing for me sometimes is just being in community with other people. Um, and so I'm not going to tell you like, hey, just be happy, or like, oh, because I talk about neutral value judgment around disability as a way to kind of counteract so many negative narratives about it. But you're living in your own body, right? And so um, acceptance is a journey. And I think, as someone who has been disabled for, I think this year will be 28 years now, I'm still going back and forth on it. The other day, this just to kind of add some levity, but the other day I found a bruise on my paralyzed arm, and I had no idea where it came from. And I didn't know if it hurt because my arm's paralyzed. And I was at lunch, or, chatting with a friend, and we're like, we'll just never know. And so um, that was that was unrelated to anything, but that's just kind of what I thought of as we round out our conversation. But Erin, I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious what your thoughts are around this, around the kind of like acceptance while / if you're
Mm-hmm.
still in your own disability struggle.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said it's okay to kind of sit in your struggle that you're having, and like, because yeah, there are parts of my disability that I don't like, and I wish I didn't have them, and I think that's okay, because not wanting to be in pain is normal, and not wanting to have, yeah, like those struggles is valid, and disability is not a monolith, and everyone, I don't want to say everyone shouldn't have to accept their disability, but everyone has the right to want change, and I think that's fine. And I think also not having services or support in your life really makes it hard to accept your disability, and I think that's valid.
And I will also acknowledge too, and I'm seeing Ivan's note here saying, the symptoms connected to your disability are kind of getting worse, is grief. And I actually wish we spent more time talking. I call it disability grief. I know
Mm-hmm.
Jane calls it body grief, but existing in a body and, as whether it's a disabled body or whether it's a disabled body that's kind of changing over time, you're going to experience grief, and that's okay. And so my other hope for you too is I often call it, or I think about the idea of like a web of support or a support system. And I like the idea that it's called a system or a web, because it means that we have different areas where we are kind of getting our cup filled. So if that is mental health support, if that is peer support, if it's community, if it's watching a Netflix rom-com, which I do a lot, with just figuring out like what that whole web of support looks like for you, and knowing, like, I think that's, I guess I'll take a step. I'll just share one thing very briefly, which is right before the start of the pandemic in 2020, I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. And I wish I didn't have to admit this, but I felt like I was like complaining the whole time. It was very difficult, as hiking at high altitude would be.
Right.
And in some ways I went with a group, right? So we had community, but I was still in my body. I still had to put one foot in front of the other to get to the
Mm-hmm.
top of that mountain. And so as much as I come out here and I say community's everything, lean on community, you are still living in your body, and it's going to be hard at times. And yeah, I think like Erin said, and like I said earlier, just like acknowledge the grief and also understand, what tools or who's in your web or who's in your support system that you can turn to. And it's also hard and isolating that you are the only one who knows how intimately you are experiencing the one body that you're in,
Yeah, and I think in the disability community that's very vocal and public, there's this idea that you always have to have pride, and I think pride is separate from your symptoms of your disability. Because to me, disability pride is about community rather than like an individual feeling, if
Yes,
that makes sense.
I love that. And to quote another disability advocate, Kara Yarkhan said something recently, and she said, while I may not be proud to be living in this disabled body, I am proud to be a part of this incredible community who who has had to be so resilient and adaptive, whether we wanted to be or not, but who continues to kind of like show up for each other, community care, as we move forward in this work.
Absolutely. So this is very exciting for me. What's next for you? And is there any plans for a part two of your
Ooh. So I love this question because it lets me sit on a little mini soapbox, which is I want to kind of interrupt. It reminds me, okay, it actually reminds me of something last year where Simone Biles, amazing American gymnast, was winning all these medals, and everyone would always ask her, "What's next?" And I think she posted something on social media and she said, "Can't I just celebrate the fact that I won these gold medals without people wondering what I'm going to do next?" And so I think for me, this book kind of felt like my Paralympic gold medal, which is just to say, I feel so grateful. I feel so grateful that it is out in the world. I feel really grateful that you, Erin, and the team chose this as your group read for the Disability Readathon. The book has been out for 7 months as of yesterday, actually. And the fact that it's still resonating with readers, and, you know, I may be biased, but I think it's needed even more now than it was 7 months ago. Um, to see that it's still resonating and I'm getting feedback from readers. And actually, at the end of this month, at the end of May, I'm actually doing a book event in Montreal, and I posted about the event in I went onto Facebook and I searched for a Facebook group so I could share the event. And someone who was in Montreal said, "I'm so glad that you're coming to town. I read your book, and I really recommend it for other people who want to learn more about kind of tools and actionable steps to really tackle ableism." And I'm like, how cool is that? That, you know, now I get to meet some of my readers who have heard about this book. And so for right now, I call it, what do I call it? I call it, last year my word was savor, and this year my word is nourish. Both seem to be about food in some way, but savoring was about like really enjoying the moment. And then nourish kind of feels like, okay, let's like rebuild and fill that cup again. But also kind of let the book like simmer for as long as it's warm or hot on the stove for.
I hear you on that. Definitely take pride in what you did and with your book. It's incredible. Um, and definitely a good resource. Every time somebody who is not familiar with disability asks me for a recommendation, I'm going to recommend this book because it's really incredible and really covers a lot.
I appreciate that. And I guess I'll also say too is, you know, like if you're not the type of person who wants to engage in the book, like I'm really excited. Like this is me in my own marathon relay is like, let me think about all the ways that people can engage with this work. And now we have a piece of art, right? So art means something different to everyone. So it's also like, okay, if your entrance into this work is, you know, maybe books don't resonate as much with you, you can still learn by engaging with the art, figuring out what statement or statements on the manifesto art resonate with you, and doing your own research in that particular realm, reading the chapter from the book, or even if you don't want to read the chapter in the book, going online and doing a search too.
Yes. Great advice. And one final question. I'm sure everyone wants to know.
Ooh.
What are other books that you recommend that feature disability?
Can I just give you a couple of books that have come out recently, or do you want
Yes.
my like personal recommendations?
Personal is good, but
Okay.
anything is
Um,
good. Yeah.
well, of course, personal recommendations. Blair Amani's book, Read This to Get Smarter. You know, I oftentimes will see my book with Emily Ladau's book, Demystifying Disability. Haben Girma's memoir, Haben. Of course, Disability Visibility by Alice Wong. She has written a couple other books since then, The Year of the Tiger, Disability Intimacy, and I believe the last one in the series is going to be called Disability Vulnerability, but don't quote me on that. And then there was a book that I remember kind of earlier on in my own journey. It was called About Us. And that book was a compilation of the New York Times kind of op-eds, disability op-ed series, taking like some of those essays and putting it together in a book. And I just love kind of engaging in any any stories where you can learn more about someone through their personal lived experience. And then recent books that have come out by disabled authors. One is called Interabled by Shane and Hannah Burkaw. It's about relationships, and then I did see Molly Burke's book is coming out in September called Unseen. So many books. And I remember, like, even on the Disability Readathon, some people were like, I already read those books. What are some other books? So I feel just really excited. There are so many. Oh, and then, of course, Jane Mattingly's This Is Body Grief just came out last month. I know Andrew Gurza has a book, Notes from a Queer Cripple. All of those I named were nonfiction books. So as you can tell, I probably read a little more nonfiction than I do fiction. And so maybe Erin has some fiction recommendations for you too.
Yes, I have a whole bunch. And they're all on the Readathon website. But I tend to read more fiction than nonfiction. And I do use the Readathon as an opportunity to grow my nonfiction list. So I definitely appreciate all your recommendations. And I appreciate you coming today. It was fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for writing your book and being here in discussion with us today.
Thanks, Erin.
And if you're watching this, thank you for participating in the readathon. It was a great year, and I hope to see everybody next time. In the meantime, join our Discord to stay up to date, and we're having it's open all year, not just during the readathon. So come join us and hang out, and yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Bye.